When I began traveling to Brazil, specifically the northeast of Brazil in a state called Ceará, where I did research for my PhD dissertation on slavery and resistance, I kept running into the same truth. The overwhelming majority of the lower class people are overwhelmingly indigenous and African ancestry. Let me say that again. The majority of the lower class, those who had the least resources, were of indigenous and African ancestry. This was actually a majority of the population. These families, they worked as ranchers, they worked as fishermen, they worked in service industries as farmers of all kinds. They also were recorded in archives where we can see they were godparents to each other's children. We see them in baptisms. We see them frequenting markets together, building homes side by side. Afro-Indigenous lives everywhere. And yet on the page and in the national story, barely a trace about this collective history. That vanishing or sleight of hand isn't unique to Brazil. Take Christopher Addicks in the United States national history. Addicks was the first person to die for what became the United States. Memory calls him black, and he was, but he was also indigenous. His Afro-Indigenous identity gets peeled away until only one layer remains. The pattern is the point. Across the Americas, Afro-Indigenous people appear just long enough to be useful, then get filed away under something else. Today we're going to name what the archives often avoid. From Ceará in Brazil to the Caribbean coast to Florida's hammocks and Rhode Island villages, we'll see how colonial power divided to rule, how churches and states misnamed, and why even the word Zambo both reveals and obscures a human reality. And I'll get back to that word, Zambo. If the untold parts of our story matter to you, hit the subscribe button, tap the bell, and share your family clues in the comments. Tell us about your family. What are they? Where are their descendants from? Are you too have indigenous or African ancestry? By the end, I promise you'll start spotting Afro-Indigenous history hiding in plain sight. We need a working term, and the historical one is Zambo. Here it points to people with both African and indigenous ancestry. But let's be clear, the word is a colonial instrument meant to sort bodies for the convenience of governors and priests. Who would marry whom? Who paid which tribute? Who could be sold or folded into the nation? Hi, you're in class with Dr. T. These terms were not made for freedom. They were used as ways to controlling populations. The labels shift from country to country. In Brazil, it was Cafuzo. On the Mosquito Coast, it was Mosquitoes Sambo. And in Central America, it was the Garafina. Black Seminoles in Florida. The reality doesn't shift. Human beings form kinships. So why use Zambo at all? Because naming the machinery is the first step to refusing it. I'll say Afro-Indigenous when I mean people. I'll say Zambo when I want you to hear the system that tried to turn people's history and render it invisible. Colonial officials feared one thing above all: solidarity. They feared solidarity. They wanted to divide and conquer across the color line. An alliance between Africans and indigenous people could make a plantation ungovernable or a frontier unprofitable. They did not want people of African ancestry or indigenous people to see that they shared common interests. This was true of poor Europeans too. In Spanish America, they banned black people from indigenous neighborhoods. They closed the legal pathways like marriage that had once allowed freedom claims. So during the colonial era, many Africans, as we know, were enslaved. But if they had children with indigenous folk, with indigenous women in this case, their children would be freed. In Portuguese Brazil, white and indigenous unions were encouraged, but black indigenous marriages were punished. They were seen as a disorder to the colonial society. They were seen as unnatural. Now, in the English colonies, they also sought to outlaw gatherings between indigenous and African people. They did not want these people together. They too sought to segregate them. They also pit them against one another. Or there were cases of black militias fighting the indigenous. And there were cases of indigenous folk hired to capture slave runaways. So there was always this element of conquer and divide. And in New England, the fear was no different. By the 1720s, many parts of Rhode Island had a mixed workforce. There were native laborers, there were free people of color, and there were indentured servants. These people often mixed together. And so there was not unusual, particularly in places like Rhode Island and the villages, of seeing mixed children. And they played together, they worked together. But to avoid these new forms of solidarity, the British did something about it. They made laws to prevent this kind of system. The tactic was always the same: sever alliances, rename mixed communities into vagueness. Musty was a common word used in the English colonial era. Mulatto was the Spanish, pardo in the Portuguese world. All of these words often were heard throughout the Americas, particularly mulatto and pardo. But these words were often vague. What did they really mean? In Latin America, sometimes a mulatto could be actually an African indigenous person. They shifted meaning, never being clear, but never encouraging these communities we often call zombos. And yet, Afro-Indigenous lives thrived, even under the fight by the colonial, quote-unquote, masters to destroy them. For example, the Garifuna carried languages and drums from St. Vincent to Central America to form Afro-Indigenous communities. The Mosquito Kingdom integrated black mariners into indigenous governance. The Black Seminoles fought the U.S. Army in places like Florida. They fought so brilliantly, they reshaped treaties and borders. In Brazil Northeast, the everyday Afro-Indigenous, you can see in archives, these people, again with vague names like Moreno, Confuso, Caboclo, but their daily lives, you could see their cultures intermixing, intertwining, a fusion, if you like. You could see it in their foods. You could see it in their working day experiences as they use their cultures to shape what would become known as the jangata, a type of fish boat that was common for fishermen. This was a very rich community based in different traditions that were fused in making one new community. In New England, planters passed laws to restrict gathering and forbid slaves from trade or even owning livestock. But they couldn't prevent cultural exchange. The colonial Reverend Joseph Fish found black and native families in his congregations. Right, so this is a reverend, and he talks about these tribes who bonded together and formed new kinships. They were mainly Christian, but they were often alienated because of the kind of segregation these communities created from the colonial societies. They were forced to be segregated in church. When they died, they were buried in separate cemeteries. These Afro-Indigenous communities learned the colonial language, the laws, and trades, mastering them enough to survive. Even later, they built their own institutions that were often, in the case of New England, viewed as black and were forced apart from indigenous communities. So within these black communities were actually indigenous folk who had been made to acculturate within that colonial order, but were seen as black. But to create true solidarity among large groups of indigenous and large groups of Africans was made almost impossible by the colonial powers. But there were cases where there were stronger bonds. Usually these groups were outside of the colonial order. The Garifuna, for example, in Central America, or the Black Seminoles, who were mainly in Florida. But in the case in Rhode Island, these communities who in many ways had acculturated into the colonial society were essentially forced into a black community, although many of these people were indeed mixed. In Brazil, in places like the Northeast, the archive uses words like pardo and other words meaning mixture. But what exact mixture or what was the context exactly of their cultures were often ignored by the colonial order. They were just seen as backwards and barbaric, not civilized. Nevertheless, we know they had cultures, and these people also, who were part of the working class, the lower classes, were indeed Afro-Indigenous communities. These sambos, if you like, give us clues to these communities. But even that word, Zambo, is problematic, right? Because it's a colonial word. These communities were fluid and oppressed because of their African and indigenous ancestry, were stigmatized. So when we say Christopher Addicts was Afro-Indigenous, the American founding changes the meaning, right? So the meaning is changed when we realize that these were Afro-Indigenous communities. They were not just black, they were not just indigenous. When you say CRI is full of Afro-Indigenous families that were poor and working class, an elite or upper middle class that was often white, with perhaps a little indigenous mixture and certainly very little African ancestry, we see the context of how class and race works. So let me spell it out. In Brazil, the poorer folk were usually more indigenous, more African, with maybe a little admixture of European, whereas the richer in the upper class tended to be mainly of European ancestry with a little bit of indigenous or African ancestry. But this was done differently, right? These kinds of colonial projects ultimately placed Europeans at the top and Africans at the bottom, and indigenous folks also at the bottom. But there were cases throughout the Americas, whether it was New England, whether it was the Northeast of Brazil, whether it was in Central America, where these Afro-Indigenous populations thrived and worked together, and they were not fighting each other all the time. They were living together, they were creating children and building families together. A lot of this is documented, but because of the nature of a history of white supremacy, those histories are often erased. History refused to say their name, but we can. We can acknowledge the moments in the powerful history of how Afro-Indigenous folks work together, who are not always enemies. But the way the colonial system worked, it was not to the colonial elite's advantage to have these groups in solidarity. They needed to be divided. If this gives you a new lens, please subscribe, smash that bell, and share it with someone who loves real history. Then tell me what words in your region, Pardo, Cobocolo, Moreno, Musty, might be covering Afro or Indigenous ancestry. Do you have family stories that hint at this? Drop them below. I read every comment, and your stories guide where we go next. Thank you.